When historians describe the street elevation projects of 1870s Chicago, they usually focus on the engineering triumph above ground, the city that lifted itself by its own bootstraps, the buildings raised on jack screws, the new street level that solved the flooding and sewage problems. But the real story, the one that barely appeared in newspapers, the one that even today sits buried in archival footnotes, began below the surface. It started with a simple civil engineering project. Engineers were instructed to raise the streets across the entire downtown district, install proper drainage, and determine whether the ground could support a modern metropolitan infrastructure. The goal was practical: elevate the roadways, improve sanitation, and prepare Chicago for its destiny as America's second city. But the moment workers began excavating beneath the old street level, something unexpected happened. They broke through layers that hadn't been exposed in living memory. Beneath the muddy thoroughfares, deeper than any official construction records indicated, the crews found structures and surfaces that didn't match the city's documented history. Their preservation was unusual. Their depth was inconsistent with the timeline, and the construction didn't resemble anything from Chicago's supposedly brief past. It didn't even resemble frontier American building, as commonly understood. This wasn't mentioned in the public celebrations of civic improvement. It didn't make it into the newspapers praising the innovative engineering. But in the internal notes of that era, a quiet phrase appears over and over again: existing construction, unexpected preservation, origin uncertain. The official story would later simplify all of this into remnants of hastily built frontier structures, abandoned cellars, or simply layers of accumulated debris from Chicago's rapid growth. Nothing unusual, nothing worth discussion. But the excavation photographs from the time, the ones developed in dim city offices while Chicago celebrated its rising streets, show something different. They show workers standing beside stone foundations cut with precision, far superior to anything frontier carpenters should have built. Buildings buried so deeply that their second and third stories now sit below the new street level. Window frames and doorways preserved in mud, as if the structures had been engulfed suddenly, not gradually abandoned or demolished. Architectural details that don't resemble the crude frontier construction Chicago claims as its earliest phase, but something older, more refined, more permanent. And the deeper they dug, the more the layers stopped looking like a young city's messy growth, and more like evidence of a catastrophic burial that had been covered up, filled in, and deliberately forgotten. At first, the engineering teams tried to categorize everything in the simplest way possible. Poor drainage over decades, gradual accumulation of street fill, settlers building on unstable marsh ground. But as notes accumulated and more buried structures were uncovered, the inconsistencies multiplied. Why were some of the buried buildings constructed with foundations designed for permanence rather than temporary frontier use? Why were certain structures preserved so completely, as if they had been abandoned in a single event, rather than gradually buried over years? Why did some foundations extend deeper than any settler would have dug in supposedly swampy, unstable terrain? And the question that troubled even the most conventional engineers: why was everything buried at nearly the same depth? The street raising required precise measurements, yet the pre-existing structures beneath parts of the loop appeared buried under a uniform layer of fill, as if something had covered the entire district at once. Engineering teams quietly admitted among themselves that the burial pattern didn't line up with gradual accumulation or poor urban planning. And although none of them were using terms like catastrophic flood, they were acknowledging something just as unsettling. The old city hadn't sunk slowly. It had been buried quickly. As the documentation increased, so did the silence. Reports became shorter. Descriptions became vague. Photographs stopped showing the most complete buried structures. And then the excavation zones were filled with new foundations in 1874, covered where needed for the elevated streets, and much of what was exposed was returned to darkness. Only fragments remained: notes, a handful of photographs, and the quiet testimonies of workers who saw what lay beneath before it was sealed again. But even from what survives, a pattern becomes visible. Buildings too well constructed for frontier Chicago. Preservation too complete for gradual burial. Architectural sophistication that looks inherited rather than improvised. Infrastructure that seems to belong to an earlier, more established city entirely. When the excavation teams moved past the first recognizable mud layers beneath Chicago streets, the expectations were simple. They believed they would find loose fill, perhaps some rotted wooden structures, and scattered debris from the city's rapid early growth. Nothing unusual, nothing extraordinary, but within months, that assumption collapsed. Instead of a chaotic jumble of frontier construction, the teams uncovered a sequence of architectural layers that didn't behave the way a young city's remains are supposed to behave. The first anomaly was uniformity. Each building, whether found on State Street, Michigan Avenue, or Lake Street, appeared buried under approximately the same depth of fill. Different construction dates shouldn't result in that. Different owners, different purposes, different years of construction. They don't all end up buried at the same level, unless something happened to all of them at once. Yet beneath Chicago streets, they did. Storefronts from one block aligned with storefronts buried on the next. Window heights matched across entire districts. Doorframes sat at consistent depths, even when the buildings were supposedly constructed years apart. It was as if every structure in downtown Chicago had been engulfed by the same event, one that no longer existed in any official record. As the workers dug deeper, the structures became more puzzling. Beneath the expected mud and debris, they began encountering construction that looked nothing like frontier building. Much more refined stonework, much more permanent foundations. Details that seemed too architecturally sophisticated for anything in Chicago's documented early history. Some buildings appeared almost over-engineered for a frontier town. Brick facades with precise coursing, crafted with skill that didn't match the rough carpentry Chicago claims from its pre-fire era. Stone lintels carved with decorative elements. Doorways framed with architectural intention. Construction that suggests established urban tradition rather than hasty frontier improvisation. And then came the discovery that puzzled even the most skeptical members of the engineering teams: pristine preservation. Buildings sealed in mud with their interiors intact. Wooden elements preserved as if protected from decay. Lower floors with furnishings still in place. Spaces that looked less like they'd been gradually abandoned, and more like they'd been suddenly buried. Yet there is no historical record of any catastrophic flood burying Chicago's downtown district. No accounts describing a sudden inundation that would seal buildings so completely. Nothing that explains why large sections of the buried structures look like they were occupied one day and entombed the next. Excavation photographs taken during the street raising show this clearly. Workers standing in buried storefronts with walls still intact. Doorways preserved so well that the original hardware remains visible. Windows sealed with their glass unbroken, protected by the same mud that supposedly accumulated gradually over decades. But the most unsettling detail was not what appeared in the photographs. It was what didn't appear in the official narrative. The reports written after the street raising barely mention the discovery of complete, buried structures. Some drawings show only the new street level and foundations, omitting what lay beneath entirely. Certain architectural finds are dismissed with vague terms like hold construction or previous grade level, even though the photographs show they were far more significant than that. The silence is hard to miss, because if these buried buildings truly belong to Chicago's documented early history, why weren't they described as remarkable engineering challenges? Why weren't the pristine buried storefronts documented as archaeological finds? Why were the photographs scattered across private collections instead of preserved in city archives? Even some of the architectural details raise questions. Stonework too refined for frontier construction. Brick patterns too sophisticated for Chicago's supposed early settlers. Decorative elements that suggested established urban craftsmanship, not the rough improvisation of a town barely 20 years old. What the excavation teams uncovered were structures that didn't match Chicago's official origin story as a muddy frontier trading post that somehow became a great city in mere decades. Instead, they found evidence of an earlier, more established urban environment, one that seemed to have been buried and built over in living memory. The first shock came with the buried commercial buildings themselves. These weren't crude frontier shops or temporary wooden structures. They were permanent commercial spaces, storefronts designed for long-term use, brick and stone construction meant to last generations. Some buildings were sealed so completely that their signs remained legible. Painted advertisements preserved in the airless mud. Others revealed display windows still intact, merchandise rooms with inventory undisturbed. Workers described entering spaces that felt frozen in time, as if the occupants had simply walked out one day and never returned. And then came the feature that still puzzles researchers today, the tunnel systems. Officially, Chicago's famous freight tunnels weren't constructed until the 1890s. But during the street raising, workers repeatedly encountered pre-existing passages, corridors connecting buildings below the supposed original street level. Infrastructure that made no sense for a frontier town built on swampy ground. Some passages were wide enough for cart traffic. Others contained ventilation systems and drainage channels that suggested sophisticated engineering. Workers from the 1870s described them in private letters as existing infrastructure, not new discoveries, systems that Chicagoans had simply been building on top of, though no one could say when they were originally constructed. Another anomaly appeared in the building foundations themselves. These weren't shallow footings resting on unstable marsh. Many extended to depths that only make sense if the builders expected the structures to stand for centuries, not decades. They were engineered for permanence, constructed with techniques that suggest that the builders had access to established architectural knowledge. It created an uncomfortable possibility. The Chicago that rose after the street elevation may not have been built from scratch. It may have been built on top of something much older. A city whose existence was never properly recorded, never properly acknowledged, and never explained in the official history of the American Midwest. The deeper the workers excavated, the stranger the pattern became. Street by street, block by block, they found evidence of an earlier urban landscape, buried under a uniform layer of fill. But the discovery that caused the most confusion was the nature of that fill itself. Some sections contained debris consistent with demolition and gradual accumulation. But other areas showed something different. Clean fill packed densely, almost deliberately, as if someone had made a conscious effort to bury the old street level quickly and completely. The official explanation offered later poor drainage management, decades of mud accumulation, the natural result of building on swamp land. But that does not explain the uniformity of burial depth. Natural accumulation is chaotic, uneven, variable. What the excavation teams found was consistent, measured, systematic. As if the entire district had been intentionally raised to hide what came before. Soon after these discoveries, something unusual began happening. The most complete buried structures were documented briefly, then filled in again. The most intact storefronts were photographed once, then sealed under new foundations. Deep sections, where architectural details were most sophisticated, were cut off from further exploration. Some of this was officially labeled as construction efficiency, necessary to keep the street raising project on schedule. But the decisions about which areas to preserve and which to bury permanently raised quiet questions among observers. The structures that were sealed immediately were always the ones that challenged Chicago's official timeline most directly. The buildings that were too well built for frontier construction, the tunnels that predated official records, the architectural sophistication that suggested a longer, more complex urban history, the preserved interiors that implied sudden burial, rather than gradual abandonment, were perhaps the most problematic finds of all. They weren't random structures. They formed a pattern, evidence of a complete urban district that had been buried and built over in a single generation. Planned, executed, and conveniently explained away as the natural result of poor urban planning, even though the evidence suggested something far more deliberate. When you study the completion of the 1874 street raising, something becomes impossible to ignore. The project didn't simply elevate the streets. It sealed away evidence. Not accidentally, not gradually, but systematically and quickly. The deeper the excavation went, the more the documentation became restricted. Early surveys included detailed notes on buried structures. But by the end, reports mentioned only the new construction, as if nothing of significance lay beneath. And this is where the real mystery begins. Because what the workers uncovered beneath Chicago streets wasn't just evidence of poor drainage or frontier carelessness. It was evidence of a complete city, buried so thoroughly that within a generation, its existence could be dismissed as legend. Multiple accounts, the few that survived in private correspondence, described architecture that suddenly made Chicago's official timeline impossible. Buildings preserved too well for decades of gradual burial. Commercial districts laid out with too much sophistication for a supposed frontier town. Infrastructure that suggested Chicago had been an established city long before it officially existed. But here's the part that always gets buried in the official histories. The most problematic evidence was sealed the fastest. Workers described being instructed to stop documenting certain buildings, to fill sections back in before photography was completed, to move past areas where the architecture was most refined. The official explanation: construction deadlines, budget constraints, practical engineering necessity. But if it was only about efficiency, why were the most sophisticated structures buried first? Why were the areas with the clearest evidence of advanced construction sealed before proper archaeological documentation? It doesn't make sense unless those discoveries posed a different kind of threat. Not a physical one, but a chronological one. Because if the structures beneath Chicago truly showed urban sophistication decades before the city's official founding, then the entire narrative of Chicago's history begins to collapse. Imagine what it would mean if modern Chicago was built on top of an earlier city, one that was deliberately buried and forgotten within living memory. Imagine what it means if the street raising wasn't just about drainage, but about covering up evidence of a catastrophic event that official histories never acknowledged. And maybe that is why the 1874 discoveries were so quickly sealed, not to support the new streets, but to support the official narrative. The surviving photographs tell their own story. Buried buildings with intact facades, preserved storefronts that should have rotted away if buried gradually, architecture that looks established, permanent, sophisticated. Nothing like the crude frontier structures Chicago claims as its beginning. These aren't the kinds of discoveries that fit neatly into textbooks. They're the kinds that make historians uncomfortable. The kinds that suggest our cities have older, stranger histories than we're told. And that brings us to the final question: why was the evidence of Chicago's earlier existence sealed away so systematically? Because when you step back, the pattern becomes clear. The sophisticated architecture was buried. The intact storefronts were buried. The tunnel systems were buried. The refined stonework was buried. Even the photographs that showed too much disappeared into private collections. Almost as if the street raising had accidentally revealed a chapter of history that was supposed to stay hidden. A chapter that suggests Chicago didn't rise from a frontier trading post. A chapter that implies something much older, much more established, was buried beneath mud and officially forgotten. And for one brief moment in 1874, while raising the streets, the truth was exposed. But instead of investigating it, they built over it, covered it, sealed it, forgot it, or pretended to. Because if Chicago's gleaming streets rest on top of a buried city we no longer acknowledge, then the real question is not what was discovered in 1874. It's how many other cities were conveniently buried beneath the surface. How many other disasters provided the perfect opportunity to hide the past? How many other urban landscapes were systematically covered and built over before anyone thought to question the official story? Thanks for watching. And if you found this interesting, well, there are a lot more cities with stories like this. Maybe I'll see you in the next one.